She spent years mocking her neighbor, but when her car broke down on an empty road, he was the only one who stopped to help. What happened next will change the way you see others forever. Stay till the end. This story might just change your heart too. Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories. Thanks. Let's start the story. The road stretched endlessly into the horizon, its cracked asphalt worn by time and weather. On either side, sprawling fields lay motionless under the dimming light of the setting sun. The sky was streaked with shades of orange and purple, slowly fading into the deep blue of evening. A soft breeze blew across the landscape, rustling the dry grass that bordered the road. The silence was eerie, broken only by the occasional chirp of a distant bird. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the world felt empty and isolated. Rachel Miller gripped the steering wheel of her sleek SUV, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against it impatiently. She was a woman in her mid-40s, dressed in a pressed blouse and tailored pants, her sharp features set in a perpetual frown of dissatisfaction. Rachel was the kind of person who liked things done her way, efficiently, neatly, and predictably. She had spent the afternoon at a charity luncheon, mingling with other well-to-do suburbanites, exchanging shallow pleasantries, and subtly criticizing everything from the food to the decor. As she drove down the quiet road, she sighed, glancing at the clock on the dashboard. It was late, and she hated being out after sunset, especially on unfamiliar routes. Rachel had taken a back road to avoid traffic, a decision she now regretted. The empty stretch of road ahead felt unnervingly quiet, and with every mile, her irritation grew. Her thoughts drifted to Marcus Johnson, her next-door neighbor, as they often did when she was feeling particularly critical. Marcus had lived in the house beside hers for several years now, a black man in his mid-30s who kept to himself. He was polite, always greeted her with a nod or a small wave, but Rachel had never bothered to return the warmth. To her, Marcus was an outsider, someone who didn't quite fit in the neighborhood. Over the years, she had gossiped about him to her friends, questioning what he did for work, speculating about his background, and commenting on his appearance. He always seemed so casual, she'd say dismissively, though she had never actually spoken more than a handful of words to him. Kalislov, I'm an amias one, I'll show him. As far as Rachel was concerned, Marcus's very presence made her uncomfortable. He represented something unfamiliar to her, and rather than understand it, she had chosen to judge him. It was easier to build walls of assumptions than to see someone for who they truly were. The SUV jolted suddenly, pulling Rachel out of her thoughts. The dashboard lights flickered, and the engine sputtered noisily before cutting out completely. The car rolled to a stop, its tires crunching over loose gravel. Rachel frowned, turning the key in the ignition again. The engine whined but refused to start. "All right," she whispered to herself. "Great," she muttered under her breath, a wave of frustration washing over her. She tried a few more times, each attempt failing just like the last. With a huff, she grabbed her phone from the passenger seat, only to realize there was no signal. She held it up, moving it around in the hopes of catching even the faintest bar of service, but the screen remained blank. Rachel glanced out the window. The road was empty in both directions, not a car or person in sight. The vast fields, seemed to stretch endlessly, offering no comfort, no sign of help. The wind outside picked up slightly, rattling the nearby grass and making the emptiness feel even more profound. Panic began to settle in as Rachel sat back, gripping the steering wheel tightly. She was alone, miles away from anywhere, with no way to call for help. She considered waiting it out, hoping that someone would drive by soon. But the road had been empty for what felt like hours. Reluctantly, she stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath her heels. The evening air was cool against her skin, the wind tugging at her blouse as she walked around to inspect the car. Not that she knew anything about engines, but the act of looking under the hood gave her a small sense of control. She popped it open, staring blankly at the mass of metal and wires, none of which made any sense to her. "Perfect," she muttered bitterly, slamming the hood shut. She leaned against the side of the car, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she surveyed the desolate landscape. The sky was darker now, the last slivers of sunlight disappearing behind the horizon. The quiet was unsettling, the kind that made every rustle and distant sound seem amplified. Rachel checked her phone again, though she already knew it was pointless. The signal was still dead, and her battery was draining faster than she liked. Her frustration turned to anxiety as she realized just how helpless she was. Suddenly, in the distance, a figure appeared. Rachel squinted, her heart skipping a beat as she made out the shape of a man walking along the side of the road. He carried a work bag over his shoulder, his pace unhurried but steady. The closer he came, the more familiar he looked, and Rachel's stomach sank. It was Marcus. Of all the people who could have appeared, it had to be him. Rachel's pride bristled at the thought of asking him for help, the man she had dismissed and judged so harshly for years. She hesitated, torn between her growing desperation and her stubborn refusal to let him see her vulnerable. But as Marcus drew closer, the reality of her situation became impossible to ignore. She was stranded, alone, and in need of help. Pride be damned, she had no other choice. Taking a deep breath, Rachel stepped forward, her voice shaking slightly as she called out, "Marcus, can you help me, please?" "Bill." Rachel sat back in her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, her breaths shallow and uneven. The quiet around her was almost deafening, each second stretching out longer than the last. The dashboard lights had gone dark, and the faint hum of the engine had been replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. The rural road that once felt merely deserted now seemed vast and isolating, its emptiness pressing down on her like a weight. She glanced out of the windshield, the open fields on either side swaying gently in the breeze. The last rays of the setting sun had vanished, leaving only the dim glow of twilight. She could feel the unease creeping into her chest, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. No signal on her phone, no cars in sight. Nothing but the endless stretch of cracked asphalt ahead and behind her. Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She reached for her phone again, lifting it high toward the windshield in a futile attempt to catch even a faint bar of signal. Nothing. She lowered it slowly, frustration bubbling up inside her. She wasn't used to feeling helpless, and the realization made her stomach churn. Minutes passed like hours. Her fingers tapped anxiously against the steering wheel as she debated her next move. Stay in the car and wait? Walk down the road and hope for help? Neither option felt particularly safe. But sitting there wasn't making her situation any better. She opened the car door with a resigned sigh, stepping out onto the gravel. The cool evening air hit her skin, sending a slight shiver down her spine. She paced beside the vehicle, her heels crunching against the loose stones as she glanced up and down the road. Her eyes darted to the horizon, searching for any sign of headlights, but the road remained dark and still. As the car went on longer, she once again felt distracted by the windshield. Then, in the distance, she saw it, a faint glimmer of light growing brighter. Her heart leapt as she realized it was a car. Finally, someone who could help. She stepped into the middle of the road, waving her arms as the vehicle approached. The headlights grew closer, their beams cutting through the darkness. Rachel's hopes soared, a wave of relief washing over her. "Please," she muttered under her breath, her hands waving frantically. And as the car neared, it swerved slightly to avoid her without slowing down. The driver didn't even glance her way. Rachel stood frozen, her hands falling to her sides as the taillights disappeared into the distance. Her relief turned to anger, then quickly to despair. "Unbelievable," she muttered, her voice breaking slightly. She turned back toward her car, her frustration threatening to spill over. As she leaned against the hood, contemplating her next move, a figure appeared on the horizon. At first, it was just a shadow moving against the dim backdrop of the road, but as it came closer, Rachel could make out the outline of a man walking toward her, his pace steady and unhurried. Her heart sank when she recognized him. It was Marcus. Carrying a work bag over one shoulder, Marcus walked calmly, his footsteps echoing faintly in the quiet. He wore his usual attire, jeans and a simple shirt, and his expression was one of mild curiosity as he approached. Rachel froze, her instinctive pride rising to the surface. For years, she had avoided real interactions with Marcus, choosing instead to gossip about him from the safety of her own home. And now, of all people, he was the one walking toward her when she needed help the most. She considered her options. Pretend not to see him, wait for someone else, or swallow her pride and ask. Her jaw tightened as she realized she didn't have much of a choice. Taking a deep breath, Rachel stepped forward, her voice uncertain as she called out, "Marcus? Can you help me, please?" Marcus slowed to a stop, his brow furrowing slightly as he took in the sight before him. Rachel, the neighbor who had spent years avoiding him, now stood stranded on the side of the road, her car clearly out of commission. He hesitated, the memory of her dismissive remarks and cold demeanor flashing briefly in his mind. She had always kept him at arm's length, her sharp words a constant reminder of her disdain. But as he looked at her now, he saw something different. Vulnerability, desperation, a quiet plea for help. "What's wrong?" he asked calmly, setting his bag down on the ground. Rachel shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. "My car won't start," she admitted, her tone softer than he'd ever heard. "And there's no signal on my phone. I don't know what to do." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the car, then back at Rachel. Without a word, he rolled up his sleeves and stepped toward the vehicle. "Let me take a look," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. Rachel watched as Marcus moved to the front of the car, lifting the hood with practiced ease. The sight of him leaning over the engine, methodically inspecting it, stirred something unexpected in her, a mix of guilt and gratitude. She had spent so long judging him, making assumptions about who he was, and now he was the only person willing to stop and help her. As he worked, Rachel stood off to the side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She felt exposed, vulnerable, her earlier pride now crumbling under the weight of the situation. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. Consumed as she was, she couldn't resist brushing her hands over her face. Marcus glanced at her briefly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Don't mention it," he replied simply, returning his focus to the engine. For the first time in years, Rachel saw Marcus not as the distant figure she had judged from afar, but as a person, kind, capable, and entirely undeserving of the treatment she had given him. And as the silence stretched between them, she began to wonder how she could ever make it right. Marcus crouched beside the hood of Rachel's car, carefully inspecting the engine as the faint sound of crickets echoed in the distance. The evening air was cool, the rain having left a fresh, earthy scent lingering in the atmosphere. Marcus's movements were deliberate, his calm demeanor striking against the quiet chaos in Rachel's mind. She stood a few feet away, arms crossed tightly, her weight shifting nervously from one foot to the other. The glow of the fading sunlight cast long shadows across the road, making her feel even more exposed. She watched as Marcus worked, the steady rhythm of his actions in stark contrast to her jittery unease. The open hood of the car revealed a tangle of machinery that Rachel barely understood. Marcus leaned over, his hands deftly checking connections, looking for any visible issue. He paused occasionally, murmuring something to himself as he adjusted a cable or wiped away some grime. Rachel's eyes lingered on him as guilt began to creep into her chest. She remembered how she had spoken about him behind his back, dismissing him with careless remarks. She had always viewed Marcus through a lens of prejudice, never bothering to get to know him or even consider his kindness. And yet, here he was, helping her without hesitation. Then she realized that her senses had gone too tight. As the minutes dragged on, Rachel found herself reflecting on the years they had spent as neighbors. She recalled the countless times she had judged him for no reason, gossiping to her friends about his background or questioning why he lived in their neighborhood. She felt the weight of those memories now, each one a stark reminder of her ignorance. The silence between them felt heavy, and Rachel fidgeted uncomfortably. She wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but the words stuck in her throat. Finally, she mustered the courage to speak. "You seem to know cars pretty well," she said, her voice hesitant. "Is this something you do often?" Marcus didn't look up from his work, but a small smile played at the corner of his lips. "My dad was a mechanic," he said simply. "I picked up a few things from him when I was younger. It's been useful over the years." Rachel blinked, caught off guard by his answer. She hadn't known that about him. In fact, she realized with a pang of guilt she didn't know anything about him. She had spent so much time making assumptions about Marcus that she had never thought to ask about his life, his experiences, or his story. "That's impressive," she said, her words awkward and unsure. She wasn't used to complimenting him, and the unfamiliarity of it made her voice falter. "A present," he said. "Really?" Marcus glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable. "It's nothing special," he said, returning his attention to the engine. But to Rachel, it was special. Everything about this moment felt special. She watched him with a newfound respect, noticing the quiet confidence in his movements, the patience with which he approached the task. She had always seen Marcus as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in her world. But now she was starting to see him for who he really was, a kind, capable, and compassionate person. The realization hit her like a wave, leaving her breathless. How many times had she dismissed someone based on her own biases? How often had she failed to see the humanity in others because of her preconceived notions? "Thank you for helping me," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "I mean it." Marcus looked up, his expression warm but reserved. "It's no problem," he said. "We all need a little help sometimes." Rachel nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She wanted to say more, to apologize for the years of judgment and condescension, but the words felt too big, too heavy to express in that moment. Minutes passed as Marcus continued his work, occasionally wiping his hands on a rag he had pulled from his bag. Finally, with a satisfied nod, he stepped back from the car and closed the hood. "Try starting it now," he said, stepping aside. She put on more steam. Rachel slid into the driver's seat, her heart pounding as she turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered for a moment before roaring to life. Relief flooded her, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "It's running," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Marcus smiled, stepping back toward the passenger window. "It should get you home, but I'd have someone take a look at it soon," he said. "There's a garage not far from here that's pretty reliable." Rachel nodded, her eyes meeting his for the first time that evening. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come by," she admitted, her voice soft and sincere. "Thank you, Marcus. Really." He shrugged modestly, his smile faint but genuine. "I'm just glad I was here," he said simply. For the first time in years, Rachel felt something shift within her. It was as if a wall she hadn't even realized she had built was beginning to crumble. As she watched Marcus pick up his bag and prepare to leave, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for his help, but for the lesson he had unknowingly taught her. "Marcus!" she called out before he could walk away. He turned, raising an eyebrow in quiet curiosity. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "For everything. For how I've treated you all these years. I've been unfair and Marcus cut her off with a wave of his hand, his expression kind but firm. "Don't worry about it," he said. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them." Rachel felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She nodded, unable to speak, as Marcus gave her one last reassuring smile before walking down the road. As she watched him disappear into the fading light, Rachel sat back in her car, the sound of the running engine filling the quiet. She had come to this road a different person, but as she drove home, she knew she would never see the world, or her neighbor, the same way again. As Marcus picked up his work bag and prepared to leave, Rachel stood frozen, watching him in silence. Her mind raced, a storm of emotions swirling within her. Gratitude for his help, shame for how she had treated him, and a profound sense of guilt that she couldn't ignore any longer. The words she had been holding back all evening felt like a heavy weight in her chest, threatening to suffocate her if she didn't release them. She hesitated, her pride battling with the need to make things right. But as Marcus turned to leave, she knew this was her moment. Her voice, quieter than usual, broke the silence. "Marcus, wait." He paused mid-step, turning back to face her. His expression was calm, as it had been all evening, but there was a trace of curiosity in his eyes. He reached for his glass of wine, embraced his client, and gave her a hug. Rachel took a deep breath, her heart pounding. I owe you an apology, she said, her voice trembling. The words felt foreign, awkward, but necessary. I've judged you unfairly. I've been rude to you for no reason, and Her voice faltered, but she forced herself to continue. I'm sorry. The air between them grew still, the faint hum of the car engine and the distant rustle of leaves, the only sounds breaking the quiet. Rachel felt the weight of her confession hanging in the air, vulnerable and exposed. Marcus regarded her for a moment, his gaze steady but unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. A warm, genuine smile that seemed to dissolve the tension in an instant. It's okay, Rachel, he said, his tone gentle and reassuring. His response caught her off guard. She had expected resentment, maybe even anger, but instead there was only kindness in his voice. The simplicity of his words left her momentarily speechless. You're not upset? She asked, her voice small. The police? Marcus shrugged slightly, the corners of his mouth still curved in that faint smile. I never held it against you, he said. We all make mistakes. What matters is learning from them. Rachel blinked, the sincerity of his words striking her deeply. She had spent so long building walls of judgment, so long assuming the worst about people she didn't understand, and yet here he was, offering her forgiveness without hesitation. Why are you being so nice to me? She asked softly, her voice tinged with disbelief. I see. Marcus chuckled lightly, his expression calm and thoughtful. Because that's who I am, he said simply. Life's too short to hold on to anger. The words settled over her like a warm blanket, their truth undeniable. Rachel felt a lump rise in her throat, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She looked away briefly, blinking back the tears that had begun to well up in her eyes. I don't deserve your kindness, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus shook his head. Kindness isn't about what someone deserves, he said. It's about what we choose to give. The weight of his words hung in the air, their simplicity carrying a profound impact. Rachel felt as though a mirror had been held up to her, forcing her to confront the person she had been and the person she wanted to become. Thank you, she said finally, her voice trembling with sincerity. Not just for helping me tonight, but for being better than I ever was, for showing me what kindness looks like. Marcus nodded, his smile unwavering. You're welcome, he said. And for what it's worth, I think you're capable of more kindness than you realize. Rachel felt her chest tighten, the words hitting her harder than she expected. She had spent so long guarding herself, so long clinging to her assumptions and biases, that she had forgotten what it meant to truly connect with someone. Marcus, she began, her voice hesitant, I know this might not mean much, but I'll do better. I'll be better. You've shown me that I have a lot to learn. He tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. That's all anyone can do, he said. Take what you've learned and carry it forward. For the first time in years, Rachel felt a genuine sense of hope, not just for herself, but for the relationships she had neglected, the bridges she had burned. Marcus's forgiveness had given her something she hadn't realized she needed, a second chance. As Marcus picked up his bag and turned to leave once more, Rachel called out to him again. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady now. He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "You're a better person than I ever gave you credit for," she said, her tone filled with gratitude. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Marcus smiled, his eyes warm. "We all need someone to believe in us," he said simply. And with that, he walked away, his figure disappearing into the dim light of the evening. "Exercising will make you a stronger person," he said. "I'm already determined to build muscle." Rachel stood there for a moment, watching him go, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. The stillness of the night seemed less daunting now, the weight on her chest lighter than it had been in years. She climbed back into her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she stared out at the road ahead. The encounter with Marcus had changed her, subtly, profoundly, in ways she couldn't yet fully articulate. As the engine hummed quietly, Rachel whispered to herself, "I'll do better." And this time, she meant it. Rachel watched as Marcus slung his bag over his shoulder, preparing to leave. The faint sound of his footsteps against the gravel seemed almost surreal, as though she were watching a moment from someone else's life. How had it come to this? How had the man she had spent years quietly judging turned out to be the only person willing to help her when she needed it most? Before Marcus could step away completely, he paused and turned back, his expression calm and kind as always. "Take care of that car," he said, his voice warm with a touch of humor. "And if you ever need help again, you know where to find me." Rachel couldn't help but smile faintly, her earlier tension melting into gratitude. "Thank you, Marcus. Really," she said, her voice steady and sincere. He nodded once, his smile widening just enough to let her know he truly meant it. Then he turned and walked into the growing darkness, his silhouette disappearing down the road. As Rachel climbed back into her car and pulled onto the empty stretch of asphalt, her thoughts swirled with everything that had just happened. The rhythmic hum of the engine was a comforting backdrop to the whirlwind of emotions she was sorting through. She replayed the evening in her mind, remembering every small detail. The calm way Marcus had stepped in to help, his patience as he worked on the car, his kind words that had cut through her guilt like a knife. And most of all, she remembered his simple yet powerful statement, "Life's too short to hold on to anger." Those words stayed with her, echoing in her mind like a mantra. She thought about all the time she had wasted holding on to judgment, building walls between herself and Marcus based on nothing more than assumptions. How much better could things have been if she had chosen kindness instead of criticism? By the time Rachel pulled into her driveway, the street was dark and quiet, the faint glow of porch lights casting soft halos in the night. She turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at Marcus's house next door. It looked the same as it always had. Simple, unassuming. But now, it carried a new weight in her mind. The next morning, Rachel woke with a sense of determination. For the first time in years, she felt the need to make things right. She spent the better part of the day baking a batch of cookies, carefully arranging them on a plate and covering it with a neatly folded cloth. The gesture felt small compared to what Marcus had done for her, but it was a start. Taking a deep breath, Rachel walked over to Marcus's house, the plate of cookies balanced in her hands. She hesitated for a moment at his doorstep, the weight of her guilt threatening to hold her back. But then she knocked, the sound echoing softly in the quiet neighborhood. A few moments later, the door opened, and there he was, Marcus, looking slightly surprised but not unkind. His expression softened as he saw the plate in her hands. "I just wanted to say thank you," Rachel said, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "For yesterday, and for everything. These are for you, a small token of appreciation." Marcus's smile widened, and he accepted the plate with a gracious nod. "Thank you, Rachel. That's very kind of you." For the first time in years, they stood there, talking, not as neighbors who avoided each other, but as two people connecting on common ground. The conversation was light, easy, and Rachel felt a weight lifting from her chest with every passing moment. "So you get restorative sleep." Weeks later, the transformation in their relationship was unmistakable. Rachel and Marcus were often seen chatting casually in their front yards, their interactions filled with warmth and mutual respect. It was a stark contrast to the years of silence and distance that had defined their lives as neighbors. Rachel had changed in ways she hadn't thought possible. She no longer saw Marcus as an outsider, a stranger to be judged from a distance. Instead, she saw him for who he truly was, a kind, compassionate man who had shown her what it meant to rise above prejudice and embrace understanding. One afternoon, as they shared a conversation over the fence that divided their yards, Rachel reflected on the experience that had brought them to this point. She thought about how close she had come to letting her biases blind her to the goodness in someone else, and how Marcus's act of kindness had shattered those walls she had built so carefully. Sometimes, Rachel thought to herself, watching Marcus laugh at something she had said, the people we judge the harshest are the ones who teach us the greatest lesson. And with that, she smiled, knowing she had been given a second chance to get it right. The story revolves around a deep confrontation between judgment and reality, shedding light on the power of genuine human connection to break stereotypes and challenge assumptions. Rachel's initial perception of Marcus, rooted in prejudice and uninformed judgment, served as a barrier that she had constructed over years of living beside him. She had chosen to view him through a narrow lens, failing to see the kindness and depth that lay beneath the surface. It wasn't until she found herself in a moment of vulnerability, stranded and desperate for help, that her carefully constructed assumptions began to crumble. Marcus's response to her need for help was the epitome of kindness and forgiveness. Despite the years of passive-aggressive remarks and cold treatment from Rachel, he didn't hesitate to step in when she called out for assistance. His actions were not driven by obligation or any need for validation, but by a deep-seated belief in doing the right thing. His ability to rise above past grievances and extend a helping hand highlighted the transformative power of compassion. Marcus didn't need to confront Rachel with anger or resentment. Instead, his quiet strength and grace spoke volumes. As Rachel observed Marcus, her perspective began to shift. She started to see him not as the outsider she had painted him to be, but as a person with depth, dignity, and a quiet resolve that challenged everything she thought she knew. His words, "Life's too short to hold on to anger," stayed with her long after the encounter, acting as a catalyst for introspection. Rachel realized how her actions had not only impacted Marcus, but it also shaped her own understanding of the world in a way that limited her ability to connect with others genuinely. This realization marked the beginning of Rachel's transformation. The experience humbled her, forcing her to confront the biases that had shaped her interactions for so long. Her journey from prejudice to gratitude wasn't immediate, but it was sincere. By taking the step to acknowledge her past behavior and apology to Marcus, she began to embrace the possibility of change. Marcus's forgiveness and calm acceptance of her apology further reinforced the importance of compassion and understanding in overcoming divisions. Through her newfound perspective, Rachel discovered that redemption is possible when one is willing to acknowledge their mistakes and actively work toward change. Her actions following the encounter, from baking cookies as a gesture of thanks to engaging with Marcus in genuine conversations, were small but meaningful steps in rebuilding the bridge she had once burned. This transformation was not just about her relationship with Marcus, but also about the broader impact of letting go of judgment and embracing empathy. The story ultimately serves as a reminder of the profound lessons that can emerge from unexpected moments of connection. It highlights how judgment, when left unchecked, can blind us to the humanity in others, and how acts of kindness and forgiveness can break down even the most stubborn barriers. Rachel's journey reflects the potential for growth and redemption that lies within us all, showing that it's never too late to change, and that sometimes the people we least expect can teach us the most valuable lessons. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had a moment where someone surprised you with kindness? Tell us your real-life experiences or lessons that change the way you see others. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that bring us all closer together.